Welcome to Wellness with John. I'm John Peters. I'm a therapist who's been in practice for 25 years, working with thousands of patients. And this channel is about my sharing a wide variety of resources for you to lower your stress, be more happy, and be the best that you can be. So, in this video, I am going to talk about part one of understanding and working with shame and guilt. Hello, so this is part one of working with shame and guilt. In parts 2 and 3, I'm going to talk in more detail about how shame and guilt become more toxic in our lives and how we work to rework them and be more healthy. But in this video, I want to cover some basic ideas about how to think about what shame and guilt are because they are very complex and we need to understand them clearly in order to work with them constructively in our lives. So, shame and guilt are frequent human experiences. You have experienced them, I've experienced them, everybody experiences them. But they're very complex because they affect us at the level of our identity. They affect our self esteem, our values, our emotions, our emotional processing, our relationships with others. And so that's why they're so complex and sometimes challenging to work with. And they can get confusing in how to work with them, in part because one question that comes up is, where's the cutoff line at the constructive part versus the destructive part, And while I'm going to talk in part two about some intricate details of how they become destructive and toxic, in general, one way to think about constructive shame and guilt versus destructive shame and guilt is like any negative, challenging experience, it's constructive if it informs us and who we want to be in the world, how we want to be in the world, our values, and our goals. So if it's in accordance with all that and supportive of all of that in good ways, then it's constructive. If it goes beyond that, that's when we get into the destructive zone, right? So the old school idea from the 1970s and 80s about just eradicate shame and guilt and we're all golden, that's a recipe for narcissism. We don't want to have none, but we want to have a little bit and only as much as is going to be constructive, right? So, an example of constructive shame and guilt would be let's say that I agree to help somebody move some furniture, and then the day and time rolls around and I flake out, like I want to do something else at that time. I flake out, I don't show up, I don't call or text to cancel. And so then I feel bad about it. Well, that feeling bad about it actually could be very constructive if it helps me later into the future be a trustworthy person, make trustworthy agreements, follow through with agreements. That might actually be supportive of how I want to be in the world. And it's not destructive. So it's not bad to feel bad about something. It's okay as long as it's constructive and not incongruent or disproportionate and doesn't become toxic, right? So here's one way to understand shame versus guilt versus related things. So shame is the term for the feeling that we feel when we have had a violation of a fundamental expectation. I'm going to say more about what that means. But it's akin in quality in terms of the inner experience to what we term embarrassment. So embarrassment and shame feel similarly internally when we talk about the emotional quality, the emotional feeling. But they differ because embarrassment is the feeling we feel when our persona is violated, whereas shame is what we feel when a fundamental expectation is violated. And so embarrassment in comparison is more superficial and less generalized, and shame is often very deep and fundamental and gets to our core. So an example of embarrassment and a violation of our persona would be if I'm a neat and tidy person and I'm walking down the street one day and then I trip and fall in a mud puddle and I'm all disheveled and a whole bunch of people see it. So my persona, let's say, is neat and tidy, and that gets violated because of becoming disheveled, and therefore I feel embarrassment, right? Now, in the grand scheme of things, it's relatively superficial compared with a more fundamental violation, right? Although embarrassment can happen about things that are more core in terms of identity. Um, for example, I worked with a case one time where it was a family. The father was a police officer and not surprisingly had a persona of being, proper and a law and order, literally kind of guy. Unfortunately, had a teenager who was literally getting in trouble with the law about once a week. And so that criminal behavior of the teenager was violating the father's persona, right? And so it was providing a source of embarrassment, right? Now, obviously, that gets deeper into the level where the father might feel shame, but we'll talk about that distinction more later. So, guilt is a term for the idea that we did something wrong. We did something and it created an injury, a risk or an injury to ourself or someone else. And then we're having a reaction to that idea that we have done a specific thing that is wrong, right? So guilt tends to be specific, whereas shame tends to be generalized. But the feeling associated with guilt, one reason we make this distinct is that inner feeling tone when we are guilty can be shame if the violation, the thing that we did wrong, that we think was wrong, is also a violation of some fundamental expectation, or we have cognitive distortions related to how we're assessing what we did wrong or what the consequences were, or the emotional quality of guilt might be more like sadness if we aren't overgeneralizing, if we're not having cognitive distortions, and if we're keeping the perception of what was wrong more specific and isolated, and we're working with it in a healthy way. So healthy guilt, in terms of the emotional reaction, tends to feel like sadness. And we tend to call that regret or remorse. So if I did X and now I'm feeling something about X and it's proportionate and 10 people would agree that my guilt is reasonable and my reaction is reasonable, probably the thing that's going on inside of me, I would describe as I'm feeling sad about it. I did that and I'm sad that that happened. I'm sad that there was this outcome. So regret and remorse has to do with sadness as a quality and is associated with healthy guilt. Shame is where we have some sort of cognitive distortion or some sort of really profound and fundamental kind of injury that to us or someone else as a result of what we did. And so we might feel guilt and shame at the same time, right? So that's one way to think about it. Shame is a quality of emotion that has to do with a fundamental violation. It's similar to embarrassment, which is a more superficial violation. And guilt is the idea that we did something wrong or risky, and we now feel something about it. And we either are going to feel something more like shame or something more like sadness emotionally in response to the guilt. All right. So that's kind of the framework for understanding embarrassment, shame, and guilt and how they interrelate. Right. So I want to go back to shame for a minute and talk about what I mean by fundamental violation and why that results in shame rather than embarrassment. And so when we talk about fundamental violations, it has to do with, either being excluded and shunned, having unwanted, undesirable exposure, or some extreme disappointment of a very fundamental expectation of status or performance. And so here's an example of a situation that could produce shame because of a fundamental violation. Imagine a gym class where the teacher picks two students and says to them, okay, from the pool of the remaining students, I want you in turn to each pick one at a time, and you're going to make two teams for this game that we're going to play. So the two students who are the team captains, one by one, start picking the other students, right? So imagine one student who gets picked, let's say, third, fourth, fifth round in that overall process of picking from the remaining 20 or 25 students, okay? They might not feel profoundly satisfied with not getting picked first, but they get picked third, fourth, fifth. And so, okay, so they get picked on a team. And student 2, though, is picked dead last. So there are 25 students, 24 get assigned to teams, and they get picked last. And not only do they get picked last in that instance, but let's say this is a student where through their whole gym career throughout school, they have always gotten picked last. All right, they're dead last in that type of situation. That student may feel shame because that is a fundamental violation that's related to exclusion, right? And what is it violating? We might define the fundamental expectation there as I may get picked last sometimes, but I'm not going to get picked last every time, right? So a lot of us would think that's a reasonable expectation. Therefore, it's fundamental, right? If I had an expectation, I'm going to get picked first 50% of the time. Well, is it a reasonable expectation? Therefore, can it be fundamentally violated? Not really. But most of us would say, yeah, if I get picked dead last every time, that violates the expectation that I'm not going to end up in that position in the social hierarchy of gym class, right? So shame results from a fundamental violation, a violation of a fundamental expectation. I'm sorry. And by fundamental expectation, we mean, something very basic, right? So for example, people who are victims of assault often feel shame because we have a fundamental expectation that we are in control of our bodies. Our autonomy of our bodies means, in part, we get to decide what we do with our bodies and what other people do with our bodies. And that gets violated with assault. And so why does the assault then sometimes produce shame? Because that fundamental expectation of autonomy of the body and the self gets violated, right? So this is the point that we all, whether we're conscious of it, we're not walking around with a list of fundamental expectations in our head all the time, right? Unless you're a philosopher or something. But ethicists aside, we all have fundamental expectations all the time about our existence and our performance and our relationships with others, our relationship with the world. And shame can result when a fundamental expectation is violated, right? So guilt is not always associated with shame, as I said, just to reiterate that. But guilt, it kind of depends on whether or not the guilt gets associated with a fundamental violation. And that's what turns it into shame versus sadness. So I'll give you an example. Imagine let's say there's this father and he's about to finish his work shift and his boss comes in and says, "Hey, can you work over tonight? I've got some extra tasks and I need you to work some overtime." And the father knows that it's his kid's Little League game and it's the last game of the season, and his kid generally wants him to be at the games. But the father also knows the kid's been kind of ambivalent about the games, sometimes on and off, not really seemingly that into it. It hasn't seemed like that big of a deal that the father's at every game. So the father calls home and says, "Hey, I can't make it to the game. I got to work late." So then father gets home later and the son's upset. And why is the son upset? Because the son says that at the game, he hit 2 home runs and the father missed it because he worked late. Okay. So then the father instantly has a sense of guilt because he chose to take the extra hours at work and skip the game, and then it's resulted in a negative consequence. Now the son's upset, right? Now, if the father keeps that specific and proportionate, the father may feel regret and remorse. That's what we call congruent guilt, right? And then he's going to feel sad about what happened, right? That's what regret and remorse are: sadness about guilt when guilt is congruent and proportionate and healthy. Okay, so the father might feel really sad about missing the game, but if the father has the guilt and then turns that into, "I suck as a dad and I've missed the one chance to see my kid excel," then we're getting into the zone of violation of fundamental expectations, right? And so If the father then generalizes that to the level of, I suck as a parent and I've missed this one opportunity and there may never be another opportunity like this to see my son excel, then the father may feel shame about the thing that he's thinking he's guilty of, right? So that's one way to think about how guilt is sometimes associated with shame, but not always. And sometimes guilt is associated with sadness, which means that we're feeling regret or remorse about what happened, but it's staying in the congruent and proportionate zone rather than getting into the unhealthy zone. So the purpose of this video was to lay out some of these concepts so that we just have an agreement about what we're talking about. In part 2, I'm going to go into deeper detail about how shame and guilt become toxic, and that helps us understand both how we have unhealthy shame and guilt operating in our lives, but also lays the foundation for being able to then work with them when they are destructive or toxic so that we can make them more healthy. So if you like this kind of content, feel very free to hit the like button below. It helps YouTube learn who to show my videos to. And I always welcome comments because they help me to shape the type of content that I create for this channel. And if you like the channel, happy to have you subscribe as well. So stay tuned for part 2 of Shame and Guilt.